The brass never lied. That was what Clara Voss had decided somewhere around her 14th year, when the world had given her plenty of reasons to distrust most things. The front doorknob of the Mission Orphanage showed you exactly what it was. Polish it, and it shone. Neglect it, and it dulled. No pretense, no cruelty dressed as kindness, no ledger disguised as a blessing. Just metal and truth. She worked the rag in slow, deliberate circles, her knuckles raw from the lye soap she'd used an hour before on the kitchen floor. October had arrived mean this year, shouldering through the Dakota territory like a man who owned the place, which Clara supposed described most men she had encountered in her 18 years. The cold came up through the floorboards of the entryway, settled into her feet, climbed her ankles, reached her knees, working its way north with a patience that felt almost personal. She kept polishing. The motion had a beginning and an end, and right now that was more than she could say for anything else in her life. Brass doesn't care who polishes it. Tomorrow it will shine just the same for someone else. She had known this day was coming with the same certainty. She knew the creek east of town flooded every March. Reverend Holt had made the arithmetic plain enough the Sunday prior, standing at the pulpit in his good black coat, his voice carrying the particular flatness of a man closing accounts. She was 18. The church's obligation, such as it had ever been, was discharged. She would receive $1 silver, one loaf of bread, the use of this door one final time, from the inside out, not the other way around. Some doors you walk through, some doors are closed behind you. The latch drops and you understand in the marrow of your bones that the sound is permanent. The entryway smelled of beeswax and boiled turnips, that particular combination she associated with every morning of her conscious life. She would not miss it. She would not miss the narrow cot in the room she shared with 3 younger girls, or the sound of Reverend Holt's footsteps on the floorboards above her head, each evening pacing his study with the measured tread of a man who considered himself burdened by righteousness. She would not miss the sour-faced cook, Mrs. Parfit, who had never once in 10 years offered Clara a kind word, but who had on occasion left an extra biscuit near the edge of the pan, where a girl with quick hands could take it without either of them having to acknowledge the transaction. That was the closest thing to tenderness this place had managed. A biscuit near the edge of a pan. Clara finished her circles and stood back. The knob threw back a warped reflection of her face, long, angular, pale from the indoor winter dark eyes that had stopped looking surprised at things around the age of 9. Her hair was the color of creek mud, twisted back and pinned because loose hair meant a reprimand, and she had used up her tolerance for reprimands approximately 4 years ago. She wore her gray wool dress worn smooth at the knees and both elbows because it was the only dress she owned. She possessed nothing else in the world except the clothes on her back and the single smooth river stone she kept in her right pocket. The stone was the size of a sparrow's egg, pale gray, perfectly rounded by water and time. It had belonged to her mother, or so she had been told by a woman who worked in the orphanage laundry during Clara's first year there and left shortly after. Clara had no memory of her mother. She had the stone, and that was a different thing, but it was the only thing, and she had learned not to be careless with the only thing she had. The kitchen door swung open. Mrs. Parfit emerged with a pot she set down on the hallway table, with more force than necessary, her face arranged in its permanent expression of offense at the universe. She did not look at Clara. Clara did not look at her. They had perfected this particular dance over a decade, the careful choreography of 2 people who had been required to occupy the same space without ever being required to acknowledge each other's full humanity. Clara did not ask for breakfast. She went to the pantry shelf and took down the cloth-wrapped parcel that had been left for her, the bread dense and slightly stale, the kind of loaf that kept well because no one had put much tenderness into making it. She tucked it under her arm. The dollar was with Holt. She would have to see him for the dollar, which meant standing in his study, receiving whatever final words he had prepared, keeping her face arranged in a way that didn't invite further commentary. She knocked twice on the study door. He opened it himself, which surprised her. He usually made her wait long enough to establish who controlled the time in a given interaction. He was already dressed in his good coat, his gray hair combed flat, his face wearing the expression she privately called his benevolence face, the one he used for church board meetings and funerals of people he hadn't actually liked. He held out the silver dollar without preamble. The Lord provides Clara, and the world has need of strong backs. She reached for the coin. His fingers were soft. She had noticed this before and always found it faintly remarkable that a man who talked so frequently about hard work and moral labor had hands that had clearly never done either. She closed her fingers around the dollar and stepped back. That was the moment the morning broke open. The sound of a horse ridden hard reached them, first hoofbeats on frozen ground, irregular and urgent, the rhythm of an animal pushed past comfort. Then boots on the porch, heavy and fast, and the front door opened without a knock. Clara stepped aside by instinct. The man who entered was Deputy Marsh from the next county, over a lean man in his 40s whose horse she recognized from the twice-yearly circuit court visits. He was breathing hard, his face reddened by cold and speed, and he found Holt immediately with his eyes. Davies, he used the name the county knew Holt by the name from before the reverend title, "It's the Thatchers." Ruth and her husband. Fever took them both in the night. The children are alone out there, boy and a girl. They've got no one else. Clara went still. Ruth Thatcher had been her mother's sister, which made her Clara's aunt the only blood relative she had ever been told about, a woman she had never been permitted to meet or correspond with, because Holt had always found some procedural reason why such contact wasn't appropriate at the present time. Clara knew the name. She knew the town Granger, 15 miles northeast, far enough to be theoretical. She had written 2 letters in her 14th year, received no replies, eventually concluded that the silence meant indifference, which was its own kind of information. She understood now, watching Holt's face, that the silence had meant something else entirely. The Reverend's composure cracked in a way she had never witnessed before. A sudden slackness around the jaw and eyes that lasted perhaps 3 seconds before he reassembled himself. His sister. The words sat between them in the cold entryway air. His sister, who had apparently tried in some way Clara did not yet have the full shape of to reach her. His composure returned, and with it came something Clara recognized as calculation, the expression of a man who had just received 2 problems and was determining whether they could be resolved into one. He looked at the deputy. How old? A boy 9, girl 7. He looked at Clara. The arithmetic was visible on his face, plain as a sum on a schoolroom slate. Your blood kin, Clara. Providence has given you a family. You will take them. It was not a question, not a request. It was delivered in the tone he reserved for announcements of divine will, which she had long noticed always aligned conveniently with what was most useful to Reverend Holt at a given moment. He was not offering her a family. He was bundling 2 inconveniences into a single departing package and calling it God's plan. She had exactly 1 silver dollar, 1 loaf of bread, and no place to go. She thought about saying no. She held the word in her mouth, tasted it, considered its weight. She thought about the children, 2 small people she had never met, sitting alone in a house where both parents had died in the night, waiting for someone to come. She thought about what it felt like to wait for someone to come. She had done a great deal of that in her own life. She gave a single nod, not because she wasn't afraid. She was. The fear was a specific cold kind that settled in the sternum and radiated outward. But she gave the nod because there was no version of herself that could walk out that door, knowing those children were waiting, do nothing, and still remain the person she understood herself to be. The Reverend's shoulders settled, the relief of a man who has successfully transferred a weight. She noticed he did not offer a second dollar. He offered nothing additional at all, not another loaf, not a blanket, not any practical acknowledgement that he had just directed a young woman with nothing to become the sole provider for 2 grieving children in the opening days of a Dakota winter. His charity had found its precise limit, and she was standing just past it. She waited by the door she had polished. The cold continued its work on her feet. The children arrived an hour later, delivered by Deputy Marsh on a borrowed buckboard. Clara watched them from the porch as the wagon came up the road. They sat close together on the bench seat, the boy slightly in front of the girl, which told her something about him before he said a word. Their faces were the particular blankness of shock so fresh it hadn't yet decided what to become, whether it would collapse into grief or harden into something defensive. They wore clean clothes that didn't quite fit recently put on by someone else's hands. Eli Thatcher was 9 years old and had his mother's jaw. Clara would later decide, though she had never seen his mother. He was angular and fair-haired, and he looked at her with the direct, assessing gaze of a boy who had already decided he needed to be suspicious of new adults on principle and was gathering evidence. He held a cloth flour sack on his lap with both hands the way you hold the last thing you own. May Thatcher was 7 and stood behind her brother the moment Marsh lifted her down from the wagon, putting him between herself and everything else. Her eyes were very dark and a pale smudged face moving constantly cataloging, recording, filing things away. She did not make a sound. Reverend Holt presided over the transfer on the porch with the solemnity of a man who understood he was performing an official function and wished to be seen performing it well. "These are your charge now, Clara, your sacred duty." He pressed the flour sack from the wagon into her hands. Someone had transferred the children's belongings into it, and its weight was almost nothing, which was its own kind of statement. He said several more words of the type he was practiced at, producing words that carried the shape of meaning, without its substance, then stepped back toward the door. He did not offer another dollar. He did not come down off the porch. Clara looked at the two faces in front of her. She saw the grief underneath the blankness, the way you can see a river beneath ice if you know what to look for. She saw the particular wariness of children who have learned that adults sometimes mean well, yet prove unreliable anyway, and sometimes do not mean well at all. She was not their mother, not their sister. She was a stranger in a thin gray dress who had just been handed legal custody of them by a man retreating indoors. She held out her hands, one to each of them. Eli looked at her hand for a long moment before he took it. His grip was tight, embraced, ready to pull away. May's fingers were small and cold as creek-washed pebbles in January. "Come," Clara said. It was the only word she had. She did not look back at the orphanage, at the brass knob she would never polish, again at the Reverend already retreating through the door he was so eager to close. She walked them down the road away from Coldwater, and the morning opened up around them, cold and gray and enormous. For the first full mile, none of them spoke. The silence had a texture to it, not comfortable, not hostile, just the particular quiet of three people who don't yet know what they are to each other and haven't decided how to begin finding out. The road ran straight through the brown grass, which stood stiff with frost, and caught the weak October light at angles that made it look briefly silver before the clouds moved and took that away. Eli's gaze stayed fixed on the horizon. Clara had the impression he was doing the same thing she was running, calculations, assessing odds, trying to locate the shape of a plan in territory that currently offered none. He was 9 years old, doing the math on his situation with more steadiness than most adults she had observed, which told her something about the kind of household his parents had run and the kind of boy they had been raising. May walked with her eyes on the ground, which Clara first read as withdrawal, and then watching more carefully revised. The girl wasn't retreating. She was looking at things, at the way frost cracked at the edges of the wagon ruts, at a cluster of dried seed heads still clinging to a stalk, at the shadow her own boot made against the pale earth. She was paying attention to the world. She had simply gone quiet about it. Clara's mind ran its own separate channel, turning over facts like stones in a current. One silver dollar already earmarked for necessities. One loaf of bread that would be gone by tomorrow. 3 people in the opening weeks of a Dakota winter with no shelter, no stored food, no tools worth the name, no one who was coming to help them. She had spent 10 years inside 4 stone walls being told that Providence provided, and she had developed over that same decade a fairly detailed understanding of what Providence actually provided when you were young and female and possessed no property, exactly nothing, and the expectation that you should be grateful for it. She was not going to wait for Providence. A mile and a half from Coldwater, on the east side of the road, there was a general store that served the farms on the county's eastern edge. She had passed it twice in her life on errands and knew the owner by sight, a barrel-chested man named Dermot, who ran the place alone since his wife passed 3 winters ago and managed the loneliness by being aggressively fair with his prices. She turned them off the main road toward it. The bell above the door announced them with a brightness that felt incongruous. Dermot looked up from behind the counter, registered 3 things in quick succession: the gray orphanage dress, the 2 small children, the particular set of Clara's jaw that signaled a person arriving to spend money they didn't have much of on things they couldn't do without. He didn't say anything immediately, which she respected. She set the silver dollar on the counter and told him what she needed: 2 fishhooks, smallest gauge he had, a length of jute twine as much as the money would stretch to, a tin of salt, the smallest available. He moved through the store assembling these things, set them on the counter, made the calculations in his head. He named a price that was exactly fair, not generous, not inflated, exactly fair, which was its own kind of integrity. She counted out the coin, he counted back the change. Then he reached under the counter and set a folded square of burlap beside her purchases without comment, the size of a small blanket. She looked at it. She looked at him. He was already looking at something on a shelf behind her, giving her the privacy of not making the moment into something it didn't need to be. She picked up the burlap with the rest. She did not say thank you, because thank you sometimes invites a response that begins to sound like debt, and she was done accumulating obligations to people with power over her. She walked back out into the cold, the children falling in step behind her, the burlap tucked under her arm alongside the bread. They walked east. The land opened up the way land does in the territory when you get away from even a small town, suddenly completely without apology. The sky came down to meet the grass on all sides, and the space between them was the kind of enormous that stopped feeling like freedom after about 20 minutes and started feeling like exposure. Clara kept her eyes ahead and let her mind work. She knew about the creek. She had read about it in a copy of the county agricultural survey she'd found between the pages of a donated book in the orphanage library, a dry document. Nothing poetic about it, just acreage and soil type and water sources. Ironstone Creek, east of Coldwater, running roughly north to south, a ribbon of permanent water through otherwise dry ground. Land on its banks technically claimed by a man named Breckett, who owned what felt like most of the county, but wild and unfenced along the northern stretch. She had read that survey twice and filed it away in the part of her mind where she kept things that might someday matter. Today, they mattered. May stumbled on a ridge of frozen ground. The small sound that escaped her, not quite a word, not quite a cry, something in between, broke the silence. Eli was beside her instantly, his arm around her shoulders, his voice dropping into the register that boys use when they are trying to sound like something older than they are. "I got you." Clara broke a portion of bread and gave a piece to each of them without stopping walking. They ate without speaking, without thanks, the hunger too sharp for any social performance around it. She ate her own portion, slowly making herself take small bites, because she didn't know when there would be more, and her body needed to understand that this was a rationing situation, not a meal. The bread tasted of the orphanage yeast and institutional economy and the faint bitterness of baking soda used slightly past its useful life. She finished it and did not feel full. They reached Ironstone Creek by late afternoon when the light was going amber and thin, and the temperature had already begun its sharp evening drop. She heard it before she saw it, a low, continuous sound cutting through the grass, rustle and wind, the voice of moving water that doesn't stop for weather. Then the land fell away in front of them, a ravine perhaps 30 feet deep, its walls steep and thick with cottonwood and wild currant and the dried skeletons of last summer's undergrowth. The creek ran at the bottom fast and shallow, clear enough to see the rocky bed through a foot of water. It moved with the particular confidence of water that has been moving through this exact channel for centuries and intends to continue. She made her way down the ravine wall, carefully helping May on the steeper sections, Eli managing himself with a handhold on a cottonwood root. At the bottom, standing on the narrow gravel bank, with the creek sound filling her ears, she turned and looked both directions along the cut. She went north, picking her way along the bank, and found it within a few minutes a deep overhang in the eastern wall of the ravine, where a section of sandstone had sheltered back into itself, creating a space roughly 10 feet deep and 15 feet wide, the ceiling arching to perhaps 6 feet at its tallest point in the center. The opening was partially screened by a stand of wild currant grown thick enough to require pushing aside. The floor was dry, the walls were stone, the overhang extended far enough to keep rain and most snow from entering. It smelled of old animal occupation, dry earth, something mineral and cold. But beneath those things, the air was still and sheltered in a way that the open ravine was not. She pushed through the currents and stood inside, turned around, looked out at the narrow strip of creek bank visible through the opening. Then she looked at Eli and May standing a few feet back on the gravel watching her. "We'll stay here," she said, and put into her voice everything she had, every ounce of certainty she could locate or manufacture. "It's safe." Eli looked at the dark opening with an expression that said he had opinions about this and was deciding whether to voice them. He looked at his sister. He looked back at Clara. He did not say what he was thinking, which she was beginning to understand was one of his characteristic gestures, the withholding of judgment until he had more information, a quality that struck her as both admirable and exhausting. He walked inside. May followed, staying close to the wall, running her fingers along the sandstone. Clara came in last and stood in the center where she could almost stand straight. It was not a home. It was a beginning, which was the more important category. She spent the last of the daylight doing what she could. She gathered dry grass from the ravine walls, armload after armload, stuffing it into the back of the overhang to create a layer of insulation between cold stone and cold bodies. She used a sharp-edged rock to scrape at the floor, finding that the dirt was compactable, that she could smooth it and firm it. She built a small fire near the entrance, keeping it contained, letting the warmth work its way back into the space while the smoke had room to dissipate. She packed clay from the creek bank into the cracks in the sandstone walls, working it in with her fingers until the deepest gaps were sealed, the air inside losing its edge by degrees. The burlap from Dermot was not a blanket, but folded against the grass, it served as a windbreak, a division between the warmer interior air and the entryway. Eli, without being asked, gathered sticks for the fire. He moved through the ravine in the near dark with more confidence than she expected, and when he returned the second time, he had a double armload of cottonwood branches, the dry intersections she wouldn't have trusted him to identify. He set them down and didn't say anything. May sat against the back wall with her knees pulled to her chest and watched the fire. Her eyes moved in that cataloging way, recording the shape of the shadows, the way the light reached and failed against different surfaces. She had not spoken since the wagon ride. They ate more bread. Clara insisted they each take a portion larger than she was comfortable with, because children needed food in the cold, and her discomfort was less important than their ability to generate body heat through the night. She kept the smallest portion for herself, ate it slowly, and felt when it was gone the particular clarity that hunger produces, where every sensation sharpens, because the body is paying close attention to its own situation. The fire burned down to coals. Outside the ravine, dark and completely, stars appearing between the cottonwood branches overhead in clusters. A coyote called from somewhere north, its voice bouncing off the ravine walls in a way that made it sound closer than it probably was. May pressed closer to the back wall. Eli put himself between his sister and the entrance without appearing to notice he'd done it. Clara was not going to sleep. She understood this about herself. She was the kind of person whose mind treated crisis as a problem to be solved through continuous application of attention, which was useful but also meant that sleep would not come until the problem showed some sign of yielding. She sat near the entrance and watched the creek through the gap in the currant bushes, the water catching what little light remained and throwing it back in small, intermittent glints. The flour sack of the children's belongings was beside her. She had not looked inside it. It felt important to let Eli and May be the custodians of whatever it contained, to not treat their remaining possessions as a resource to be inventoried and managed. But sitting there in the dark with the children beginning to breathe the slow, deep rhythms of exhausted sleep, she noticed the sack was slightly open. A corner of fabric was visible, a small shirt carefully folded. Wedged against the shirt, the handle of something small and wooden. She looked away. It wasn't hers to look at. The night deepened. The cold deepened with it, the specific cold of Dakota in mid-October that gets into joints and muscles and applies pressure there like a slow, patient hand. Clara pulled her knees up, tucked her fingers inside her sleeves, and thought about the creek, the fish hooks in her pocket, the way the water moved over the rocks. A fish needed to go somewhere when it sensed a threat, and if you understood where it would go, you could arrange for the place. It ran to be a place it couldn't leave. This was the beginning of something. She couldn't see its full shape yet, but she could feel its logic the way you can feel the shape of a tool in a dark room by running your hands along it. She must have slept briefly toward early morning because she started awake at what felt like 3 or 4 o'clock and needed a moment to remember where she was. The fire had gone fully out. The cold had moved in to occupy the territory the warmth had vacated. May and Eli were pressed together at the back of the overhang, the burlap pulled over both of them, May's face barely visible above the edge of it. She rebuilt the fire from the coal bed patient, with it feeding it small sticks until it caught, and then larger ones until it held. Light moved back into the space. She exhaled and watched her breath disperse. A sound. She turned. Eli was awake, sitting up, watching her. He had been watching her for some time. She thought there was no sleepiness in his face, no adjustment period. He had woken and been immediately present, which was another thing that told her about the kind of child he was. He reached into the flour sack beside him. He took something out. He leaned forward and set it on the dirt floor between them, a small folding knife, the bone handle worn smooth by long handling, the blade short and practical. A working knife, a father's knife. He set it down, pulled his hand back, and looked at her. It was not a gift. She understood that. Not a surrender either. It was something more precise and harder to name, the gesture of a boy who had decided to hold off on his judgment a little longer, who was extending a narrow ledge of provisional trust without any guarantee of what came after. We are here. I am here. I have not decided anything yet. She looked at the knife. She picked it up and turned it in her hands, checking the blade, the way you check a tool not for show, but to actually know what she was working with. It was sharp, well cared for. She closed it and set it back between them, not taking it, not refusing it, leaving it in the territory between them where it had landed. He looked at the knife, he looked at her. Neither of them said anything because there was nothing to say yet that wouldn't get in the way of the thing that was beginning to happen. Outside, the creek moved. The coyote called once more, far north now, its voice thinned by distance. The cottonwoods at the top of the ravine shook slightly in a wind that didn't reach them down in the cut. Clara put another stick on the fire, felt the heat push back against the cold, and thought, this is the first morning. There would be others. She would have to make them possible. The bread was almost gone. The fishhooks were in her pocket. The dollar was spent. The knife sat on the floor between her and a boy she did not yet know, who did not yet know her, and in the sleeping form of his sister against the far wall, there was a grief so new it hadn't yet understood its own dimensions. She put her hand in her pocket. The riverstone was there, smooth and cool against her palm. She held it and felt its weight, its particular gravity, the way it always reminded her that some things endure the current and come out the other side, smaller, yes, but also more perfectly themselves. In her other pocket, folded carefully, there was a letter. Ruth's letter with its envelope addressed in a hand she didn't know, her own name written in the careful script of a woman who had wanted to be found. She had not opened it. She would open it, but not yet. Some things you had to be ready for, and she was not yet ready for this one. The night was long and the cold was real, and the morning would require everything she had. She held the stone and watched the fire and waited for the light. The fourth morning, May still had not spoken. Clara had stopped counting the hours of silence and started counting other things, instead the number of cattail roots she could dig before her fingers went numb. The approximate weight of the fish, the 2 small hooks, had yielded across 3 days of patient, Creekside, waiting the board feet of dry wood Eli had stacked against the eastern wall of the overhang without being asked. These were numbers that meant something. The silence was a fact she could not calculate around, so she stopped trying and worked with what she had. What she had was not much. The bread was gone. The salt was being rationed with a care that bordered on ceremony, a few grains on the fish, a few more on the cattail roots, enough to make the food feel like food rather than mere sustenance. The fish hooks had produced 3 small creek perch across as many days, each one cleaned with Eli's knife and cooked over the fire on flat stones, the flesh flaking apart in the particular way of fish that have spent their lives in cold, fast water, lean and not unpleasant if you were hungry enough. Clara was hungry enough. She suspected Eli and May were hungrier than they let on, which was its own kind of heartbreak. Children who had already learned to manage the appearance of their needs. The cattail roots were the more reliable source. The marsh ground at the north bend of the creek, where the water slowed and spread before narrowing again, held a dense stand of them, their brown heads gone to fluff in the October air. Clara had waded in twice now. Her skirt knotted above her knees, pulling the roots from the cold mud with both hands. Roasted over the fire, they were starchy and bland, the food equivalent of determination rather than pleasure, but they held the body together, and that was the function she required of them. She was building a catalog in her mind the way the orphanage gardener, a wiry man named Spence, who had lasted 3 years before the institution wore him down, and he moved on, had taught her to do. During the summers she'd spent working his vegetable rows. Spence was not a warm man, but he was a precise one, and precision had been more useful to her than warmth in the long run. He had taught her to read ground, to understand what soil moisture and slope and sun exposure meant for what would grow, and she had carried that knowledge into every subsequent year like a tool she couldn't put down. She was reading the creek now the same way. The perch came to the slower water at dawn and again in the late afternoon. The muskrat trails in the mud north of the marsh told her where the bank was most sheltered from the wind. The cottonwoods on the eastern wall dropped their leaves in a sequence that let her track which sections of bank got the most afternoon sun, relevant to where ice would form last when the hard freeze finally came. The hard freeze was coming. She could feel it in the way the temperature now dropped, not at sunset, but at mid-afternoon, the sky taking on that particular pewter quality that Dakota wore before a serious cold front. They had perhaps 3 weeks before the creek surface would begin to ice at the edges. After that, the hooks would be useless. After that, the roots would be locked under frozen ground. After that, 3 people in an overhang with a fire and not enough stored food were not 3 people in a sustainable situation. They were 3 people in a slow emergency. She had to build the weir before the freeze. The idea had been circling her since the second day, the way useful thoughts do when they're not quite ready to be acted on. She had read about it, a description in a page of torn agricultural survey, a secondary reference to methods used by earlier inhabitants of the territory for managing fish harvests in flowing water. The geometry was simple enough to reconstruct from memory: 2 arms extending from opposite banks, converging downstream into a narrower channel with a trap at the point. Water moved through, fish followed the current into the narrowing. The trap closed the exit. The fish had nowhere to go that wasn't captivity. Simple in concept. The execution was another category entirely. She spent the 5th morning standing in the creek to her shins, cold enough to make her teeth ache, studying the bed. She was looking for the right location, a section where the banks were close enough that she could work both sides, where the current was strong enough to guide fish, but not so strong it would destroy her construction before she could anchor it. She found it 40 yards south of the overhang, where the ravine walls came within 20 feet of each other, and the water ran in a clean, direct line over a bed of flat stone. Good substrate, workable width, enough depth to keep fish from simply swimming over the top of a low barrier. She had no plan beyond the geometry, no expertise. She had the image in her mind, 2 hands, the certainty, cold and clean, as the water itself, that doing something was categorically different from doing nothing, even if the something failed. The first day was a failure by any measure that mattered. She spent 6 hours in and around the water carrying rocks from the downstream section of the creek, where they were most plentiful, stacking them in two lines extending from each bank toward the center. The current was not interested in her plans. It moved around the rocks under them, through the gaps between them, dismantling her work with the patient efficiency of something that had been moving in this direction for longer than she had been alive. By mid-afternoon, she had a low, irregular mound of stones that resembled nothing so much as a failed idea, and her back had developed a specific deep ache, distinct from ordinary tiredness. The ache of muscles used in ways they hadn't been prepared for, complaining in terms she couldn't ignore. She sat on the bank and looked at what she had built. She felt the cold coming off the water and thought about the bread being gone and the fish being insufficient and the weeks contracting ahead of her like a closing hand. This was the moment she had known would come, the moment when the gap between what she needed to do and what she was actually capable of doing became visible in its full dimensions. She was not an engineer, not a carpenter. She was an 18-year-old woman who had spent a decade cleaning floors and polishing brass and learning from a wiry gardener how to read ground. The creek did not care about her situation. The cold did not care about her effort. They would continue regardless. She was still looking at the water when May came and sat beside Weir. The girl had followed her to the creek every day, sitting on the bank at a careful distance, watching without commentary. She never got in the water. She never offered help or opposition. She simply occupied the bank as a witness, and Clara had found, in a way, she couldn't fully explain that the witnessing mattered. It was different from being watched. It was closer to being accompanied. May sat close enough that their sleeves touched. She did not look at Clara. She looked at the failed stone lines in the water, her dark eyes moving along their shape, reading something in them that she didn't choose to speak aloud. After a long moment, she picked up a stick from the gravel, leaned forward, and drew two lines in the wet sand of the bank. Two lines converging at a point like a letter V written large enough to stand in. She drew them without hesitation, without the tentativeness of a child making a suggestion. She drew them the way you draw something you can see clearly. Clara looked at the drawing. She looked at the stone lines in the water. She looked at the drawing again. She had been building both arms of the V at the same angle, treating the two sides as mirrors of each other, parallel rather than converging. The fish trap required that the arms angle toward each other, narrowing the channel progressively so that the current itself became the mechanism, so that following the water meant following it into the trap. She had been building walls. She needed to be building a funnel. The geometry reorganized itself in her mind. She stood up. Her back still ached. She went back into the water. Eli found her there an hour later and stood on the bank watching her work. She expected him to leave after a few minutes. He didn't. He watched the way she was angling the new stones, a slight inward lean she'd given to the eastern arm. Then without a word, he moved to the downstream section of the creek and began pulling rocks from the bed. He hauled them to the bank. He stacked them where she could reach them without having to go as far from the construction site. He did this for the rest of the afternoon without speaking, and when the light failed and they retreated to the overhang, he still didn't say anything about it, just cleaned the mud from his hands and sat by the fire with the particular quietness of a person who has done useful work and doesn't need it acknowledged. She acknowledged it anyway. You picked good stones. Flat ones hold better. He looked at the fire. The corner of his mouth moved in something that wasn't quite a smile but was adjacent to one. The second day went better. The repositioned eastern arm held through the morning current, and by afternoon, she had extended it far enough that the narrowing effect was measurable. She could see the water accelerating slightly as it moved through the reduced channel, which was exactly what she needed. The acceleration was what would guide the fish. She began on the willow branch, weaving that would fill the gaps between the stones, cutting withies from the stand upstream, with Eli's knife soaking them briefly in the current to increase their flexibility, bending them into the spaces between rocks and anchoring them with smaller stones pressed in from above. The weaving was slow. Her fingers were raw from the cold water. Within the first hour, the skin splitting at the knuckle creases and bleeding in thin lines that the creek washed away as fast as they appeared. She worked through it, Pain was information, not instruction. She noted it and continued. On the third day, the man appeared on the opposite bank. She saw him the way you see something that has been there longer than you noticed it suddenly present, rather than suddenly arrived. He was old, though old was an imprecise category for what she meant. He had the age of someone who had spent most of their years outdoors, which compressed time differently than indoor living did. His face was weathered to the color and texture of the ravine walls, cross-hatched with lines that seemed less like wrinkles than a map of the decisions he'd made. He wore buckskins, practical worn, nothing performative about them, and leaned on a walking stick he held not like a crutch, but like a tool, the grip of a man who uses his hands professionally. No rifle. He looked at the construction in the water. He looked at Eli on the bank. He looked at Clara standing mid-creek with her skirt knotted and her arms full of wet willow branches. His expression did not change in any way that she could read. After a time, perhaps 3 minutes long enough that she was sure he was going to say something, he turned and walked back through the trees on his side of the ravine and was gone. Clara watched the place where he had been. Eli was watching it too. You know him. His voice was careful, withholding judgment until he had more information. No, she went back to the weaving, but she was aware of the place where the man had stood for the rest of the afternoon, aware of it the way you're aware of a door you've noticed but haven't tried. 2 days later, he was there again in the same position, watching the same unreadable attention. This time, when he turned to go, he stopped, set something down on a flat rock at the water's edge, on his side of the creek, and walked into the trees without looking back. She waded across. The current was higher today, overnight rain upstream, and she went carefully planting each foot before lifting the other, the water cold enough through her skirt to take her breath in small increments. On the rock, a coil of rope manila, thick and well-made, not new, but well-maintained with the stiffness of something that had been properly stored. Beside it, a hatchet short-handled, the blade recently ground to an edge that caught the gray sky and returned it as a line of brightness. She stood on his bank and held the hatchet, felt its weight, its balance, the particular gravity of a good tool. Someone had cared for this. Someone had decided it should be used for what she was building rather than for something else, and had made that decision quietly without requiring anything in exchange. She thought about the burlap from Dermot, the same quality of giving, practical and anonymous, without the weight of obligation attached. She was beginning to understand that there was a type of person who moved through the world this way, who saw what was needed and addressed it without making you pay for the address. She had met very few of them. She was grateful in a way that didn't require expression, a gratitude that lived in the fact of working harder rather than in words. The hatchet changed the construction in a single afternoon. She cut stakes with a precision the knife hadn't allowed, straight, consistent, an inch in diameter. The ends cut to sharp points she could drive into the creek bed by loading a flat stone over the head and pressing her body weight down. The stakes held in a way the unshaped branches never had. She drove a line of them along each arm of the V inside the stone foundation, then wove the willow withes between them until the walls were dense enough to block the current without stopping it entirely, the water moving through in a seep rather than a flow, which was the balance she needed. The rope allowed her to bind the frame at intervals, lashing stakes to each other in an X pattern that distributed the force of the current across the whole structure rather than concentrating it at individual points. She had learned this principle from Spence, who had explained it while building tomato frames, the difference between a structure that bears load from the top down and one that distributes it across a plane. She had not known she would need this information for something other than tomatoes. She was grateful she had retained it. May began to come closer to the water's edge during this phase of the work. She didn't wade in, but she moved from her customary distance to the very edge of the bank, sitting with her feet dangling above the current, watching the construction with the focused attention she brought to everything she observed. Twice she reached out with her stick and drew something in the mud of the bank adjustments Clara realized to what she was seeing. Small corrections to the geometry, noticing where a section of weaving had an irregular gap, indicating it not with words, but with a mark in the mud at the corresponding position. Clara checked the marks against the work each time. Both times the girl was right. She did not comment on this. Neither did May. It became a system. The trap itself took 2 full days. At the narrow point of the V, where the two arms converged to a gap of roughly 4 feet, she constructed an enclosure, a box built of the tightest willow weaving she'd managed, reinforced with rope anchored to the creek bed with driven stakes. The entrance was wide, facing upstream oriented, so the current carried naturally through it. The back and sides were solid enough to contain a fish that had followed the current and turned around and was now looking for the way out. The looking would be the last thing it did as a free animal. When she finished the final section and stood back in the current and looked at the whole structure, she felt something she did not have a precise word for, not pride, which implied an audience, and not relief, which implied she'd been afraid it wouldn't work, though. Of course, she'd been afraid of exactly that. It was something older and simpler than either of those. The feeling of having made a real thing in the real world that hadn't existed before and now did. The creek moved through it and around it, and the structure stood, not gracefully. Nothing about it was graceful, but solidly, stubbornly, with the persistence of something that intends to remain. She waded back to the bank. Eli and May were both there standing side by side, and she saw on Eli's face something she had not seen since the wagon ride from Coldwater, an expression that had not yet hardened into watchfulness. Something still open in it, a 9-year-old's face briefly uncaged. May's expression was more complicated and quieter, but her eyes were moving over the weir with an attention different from her usual cataloging. She was looking at it the way you look at something you helped make. "Now we wait," Clara said. Her voice came out rougher than she intended, her throat dry from a day of breathing cold air through her mouth while she worked. "How long?" Eli's question was practical, not impatient. "Through the night. Check it in the morning." That night was the longest since the first one. She lay in the back of the overhang and listened to the creek and thought about all the ways it might not work. The trap might be too loosely woven, the gaps too wide for the fish to feel contained. The entrance angle might be wrong. The fish might not be moving at night in water this cold. The structure might have shifted in the hours since she left it, some underwater stone rolling and destabilizing a stake. She had no way of knowing anything about its current condition from where she lay, and this was its own particular education in the difference between work you have done and results you cannot control. She had done everything she knew how to do. What came after that was not in her hands. She had Eli's knife in her pocket, which he had given her to use on the willow withies and which she had continued to carry. She noted that he hadn't asked for it back, which she was choosing to interpret as permission rather than oversight. The stone was in her other pocket. She held it in her fist under the burlap and felt its smooth weight and thought about the letter still unread in its fold of cloth inside her dress. She thought about what a woman writes when she is trying to find a niece she has never met, trying to reach through whatever wall stands between them. She had seen Holt's hand move toward that letter and pull back. She had seen his face when Deputy Marsh named the children. There was a story in those 2 moments, and she was not yet ready to hear it because she needed all of her capacity right now for the creek and the cold in the 3 of them. Grief, she had learned, requires its own capacity. She would read it when she had something more to stand on. The storm came at the edge of midnight. She felt it before she heard it, a change in pressure, the air suddenly purposeful and directional in a way it hadn't been, the fire near the entrance, guttering sideways. Then the sound reached them, wind at the top of the ravine, the cottonwoods beginning their distressed percussion, and under it, the rising voice of the creek, louder, faster, fed by something happening upstream. She was on her feet and moving before she had made a conscious decision to move. The temperature had dropped perhaps 15 degrees in the previous hour. She could feel it in the quality of the cold, which was now the kind that planned to stay. The creek sound was wrong. She knew its ordinary register well enough to know that what she was hearing was not it. She went down the bank in the dark without a light, her hands finding the ravine wall, and following it, her feet reading the ground. The creek had risen 6 inches in the past 2 hours. She could feel it, the water reaching the tops of her boots, when she stepped in to check the upstream arm of the weir. The current was stronger, pulling at her legs with more intention than it had during construction, the stakes she touched vibrating with a low frequency she felt in her palms. Eli was behind her. She heard him hit the water and felt him move to the other side of the upstream arm without being told, understanding without discussion that she needed weight and pressure on both sides simultaneously. They worked in the dark, in the rising wind, their movements finding a rough coordination through touch and inference, pressing fallen stakes back into the bed, loading stones against the base where the current was pulling. The noise of the storm and the creek together was loud enough that talking would have been difficult even if either of them had wanted to. The rain came sideways. Within minutes, they were both soaked through, and the cold was the most serious physical sensation Clara had ever experienced, not painful in the way of a cut or a burn, but totalizing the body suddenly preoccupied entirely with its own temperature at the expense of everything else. She gritted her teeth and continued. Her hands were doing the work by feel now, her vision useless in the dark. And rain. And she found that her hands knew things about the construction she hadn't consciously registered, which stakes were secure, which had the slight give of inadequate anchoring, where the weaving was tightest and where it had worn thin under days of current. A stake on the eastern arm pulled free. She felt it go, lunged for it, got it, drove it back with a stone she found by feel on the creek bed, her whole body below the surface for a moment that stripped the remaining warmth from her core. She came up gasping. Eli appeared at her shoulder and added his weight to the stone, pressing down with both hands, and between the two of them the stake held. The weir held. She felt this happen as a physical fact, felt the vibration in the frame, shift from urgent to stable, felt the current, accept the structure. Rather than fighting it, felt the whole thing settle into a new equilibrium with the raised water. She stood in the dark, in the rain with her arms shaking from cold and exertion, and felt the structure hold beneath her hands, and the feeling was so overwhelming in its specific quality that she had to close her eyes against it, which accomplished nothing in the dark except to concentrate the sensation inward. She made it back to the bank. She sat down heavily on the gravel, and her legs would not immediately do anything useful, and she let them rest. Eli sat beside her, breathing hard, his wet hair plastered flat. They were both shaking with the sustained cold, the uncontrolled kind that comes after the body has spent its emergency reserves. You need to go warm up. Her voice was steadier than she expected, which was its own kind of determination. He didn't move immediately. Then you too. Not a question, not an offer, a condition. She looked at him. In the dark, she couldn't see his face clearly, just the shape of him, the set of his shoulders. He had not asked her once in all the days since Coldwater why she was doing any of this. He had simply watched and assessed, and when he understood what was needed, added himself to it without requiring explanation or ceremony. She pushed herself upright. Her legs cooperated barely. He was beside her as they went back up the bank, and she was aware of his presence in the way you become aware of the reliability of a wall. Not consciously, not with gratitude exactly, but as a structural fact you begin to organize your balance around. She had cut her forearm on something, a submerged stone, she thought, or the edge of a stake, and felt the cut only now, the warmth of it registering against the cold of everything else. Eli noticed it before she did in the firelight of the overhang. He tore a strip from the bottom of his own shirt without hesitation or drama and wound it around her arm with the careful efficiency of someone who had bandaged things before. She watched his hands work and thought his father taught him that too. It held, he said when he'd finished, not looking at her, looking at his work. Yes, she looked at it too. It held. May was awake in the back of the overhang, sitting up watching them both with eyes that were already dry. She had been afraid, Clara thought, but had been afraid quietly the way she did everything. She looked at Clara's bandaged arm. She looked at the fire. She reached out and added 2 sticks to it, precisely placed, and the fire responded with more warmth. That was May's contribution to the moment, and it was sufficient. 3 weeks after the weir went in, the animal came. It came at the 3rd hour of the night, when even Clara's attentive sleep had finally deepened past awareness. The sound that woke her was something falling the fish rack, the green wood smoking structure she'd built against the eastern wall of the overhang exterior, where days of surplus perch and two small catfish were working their way toward preservation. The sound of the rack going over was followed by something larger and heavier, the specific quality of weight that belongs to animals rather than weather. She was at the entrance before she was fully awake, and the shape she saw in the darkness 15 feet away, large, dark, moving with the unhurried confidence of something that does not typically encounter meaningful resistance, registered in her body as pure animal alarm, the kind that bypasses thought entirely and goes directly to action. She grabbed for the fire, pulling a burning branch free, and made noise, a sound she hadn't made since girlhood, uncontrolled and loud, her voice hitting pitches she didn't normally use. She grabbed a second branch and thrust both outward, two lines of light and heat between herself and the shape in the dark. The shape retreated, not in fear and inconvenience. It moved back from the light with the deliberateness of something recalibrating, not fleeing, and disappeared back into the ravine darkness. She stood at the entrance for a long time after both branches, still in her hands, the cold irrelevant. Behind her, she could hear Eli's breathing fast and alert. May had pressed herself against the far wall in silence. In the morning, she surveyed what remained. The rack was down. The supports had been snapped rather than bent, which told her something about the force that had been applied to them. Of the smoked fish, 8 days of careful incremental preservation, approximately half remained scattered and partially consumed. The rest was gone. She gathered what could be salvaged, working methodically because methodical was the only option available to her. She rebuilt the rack later that day, higher off the ground, and drove stakes into the earth around its base that she hoped would give pause to a return visit. She noted the weight of the loss, not with despair, but with the sober accounting of someone who now had a smaller margin. When she went back to the entrance to check the stakes that evening, she looked at the ground in the thin remaining light. The tracks were large and clear in the mud. One set of them stopped 2 steps from where she had been standing. She measured the distance. With her eyes did not share this information with the children, went inside and rebuilt the fire higher than usual. That night, for the first time since they had come to the creek, she did not sleep at all. 6 days after the rack incident, the trap full again with new catches, the loss partially recovered. Eli checked the weir at first light and called back to her from downstream, with a sound she had not heard from him before, loud, unguarded, the voice he would use if no one had told him yet that joy was a resource to be conserved. May came out of the overhang at the sound and ran down the bank without her careful composure, and Clara followed, and the 3 of them stood at the weir and looked through the woven branches at the water inside. Silver, flash after flash, a dozen fish at least moving in the enclosed water in slow, confused circles, looking for the exit they were not going to find. Clara's throat closed. She turned it into a cough and looked upstream, giving herself the necessary seconds. She heard May's voice for the first time in the 17 days since Coldwater, clear, direct, aimed at no one in particular, and at the same time at someone specific who was not there. Mama would have liked this. The words went into the air and stayed there. The creek moved through the weir. Clara kept looking upstream until she was certain her face was arranged correctly. Then she waded in and started the harvest. They ate that evening until they were full for the first time since the orphanage, a sensation so foreign by now that it required a moment of adjustment, the body uncertain what to do with adequacy after weeks of calibrated shortage. The fire was high, the overhang was warm, and May fell asleep against Clara's side before the coals had dimmed her weight against Clara's ribs, a thing so particular and specific in its trust that Clara went very still and did not move for a long time after. Eli was still awake. He was looking at the fire with the expression she had come to read as his thinking face, the one where the internal machinery was running at full capacity. He said without preface, "We're going to be all right, aren't we?" It was not a question quite. It was the thing you say when you have been afraid to believe something and have finally gathered enough evidence to risk saying it. Clara looked at the fire. She thought about the winter ahead. The ground that would freeze the creek, that would ice at the edges, the weir that would need maintenance, the stores that needed to be larger, the overhang that would need more work before the deep cold arrived. She thought about all of it, the full weight of it, the ways it could still fail. She thought about a man on the opposite bank who had left a rope and a hatchet and asked for nothing. She thought about a girl who drew a V in the mud when she had no other language available. Yes, she said, meant it as something more than comfort, meant it as the conclusion of a specific calculation checked and rechecked that had finally come out on the side of survival. Outside Beckett was coming. She did not know this yet. The weir stood in the dark water, the fish moved through it, the fire held, and for one night they allowed themselves to simply be warm. Beckett came on a Tuesday, which Clara only knew because Eli had been marking days on the sandstone wall of the overhang with a small piece of chalk rock since the second week. 23 marks, 3 weeks and 2 days since Coldwater. The marks were precise and evenly spaced, the work of a boy who understood that losing track of time was a form of losing ground. She heard the horses before she saw them, 2 sets of hoof beats at the top of the ravine, moving with the unhurried authority of animals whose riders believe the land beneath their feet belongs to them. She was at the weir when they appeared on the eastern rim, and she looked up without moving her hands, still in the cold water, her body going very still in the way of someone who has learned that stillness buys time to think. Colonel Harlan Beckett was a large man, made larger by the quality of everything he wore: good wool coat, good boots, the kind of hat that announced income before the face beneath it had a chance to announce anything at all. He sat his horse with the ease of someone who had spent 40 years being looked up at and found it natural. Beside him, a step back, a younger man on a dark horse, broad-shouldered, watching Clara with an expression she couldn't fully read from this distance, not hostile, not sympathetic, something more careful than either. Beckett looked at the weir, he looked at the overhang where smoke was rising from the entrance. He looked at Eli and May on the bank, who had gone still, the way children go still when adults arrive carrying authority. His gaze moved across all of it with the systematic quality of a man conducting an inventory, and when it settled on Clara, it carried the particular weight of someone who has never been told no by a person standing in a creek. This is private property. His voice came down the ravine wall easily, the voice of a man accustomed to being heard without raising it. I want you gone by morning. Clara straightened. The water moved around her legs. She looked up at him across the 30 feet of vertical rock and cold air between them and said no, putting into the word everything she had built in 3 weeks, every stone lifted, every stake driven, every night spent calculating the margin between survival and its absence. It was not defiance for its own sake. It was the sound a structure makes when it has been built solidly enough to bear weight. Beckett's composure registered the word and rejected it. His horse shifted beneath him, reading something in its rider's body. I will have the sheriff remove you. The declaration was the kind that expects to end conversations. Clara looked at him steadily, the cold water moving past her ankles, her voice level and carrying. Then you will need to explain to the county why you're removing 3 orphaned children from a creek bank in November. Bring the sheriff. We will be here. She turned back to the weir. She heard him say something to his companion, one word low and clipped. She heard the hoof beats move back from the rim. She did not look up again until the sound had faded entirely, and when she did look up, the rim was empty and gray, and the cottonwoods at its edge moved in the wind and told her nothing she didn't already know. What she knew was this: he had said Friday. She had heard it clearly, that single word directed at the younger man before they turned. Not a question, not a suggestion, a date, a deadline. The conversation was not over. It was simply moving into a different phase, and the next move would not be Beckett's voice from the rim, but a legal instrument in someone else's hand, and she needed to think about what she had to meet it with. She had the weir. She had 3 weeks of demonstrated occupation. She had the specific location of the land, which she had read about in the county agricultural survey, and she had the memory of that survey clear enough to recall that its language regarding Brackett's northern parcels had been imprecise about the creek bed itself. Upland acreage was listed, but the creek bed and its immediate banks were noted as subject to territorial water rights, which was different from private ownership. She was not a lawyer. She had no lawyer. But she had a mind that retained what it read, and what she had read suggested there was a question worth asking. Silas came across the creek that evening. He had begun crossing to her side in the second week after the hatchet and rope, standing at a distance that was respectful rather than remote, and watching the construction with the attention of someone who understood what he was looking at. But this evening, he came all the way to the fire, which he had not done before, and sat down on the flat stone near the entrance that had become by unspoken agreement the place where serious things were discussed. He was quiet for a long time. The fire worked between them. May was inside already asleep. Eli sat at the edge of the firelight, not pretending he wasn't listening. Brackett came, Silas said finally. It wasn't a question. He had the kind of awareness of his territory that came from long years of paying attention to it. He mentioned Friday. Clara kept her voice even. He'll bring the sheriff. Silas looked at the fire. He had a way of looking at things direct, without performance, that she had come to find steadying rather than uncomfortable. Aldous Crane is the sheriff. He's a fair man. Not Brackett's man, but he works with what the law gives him. He paused. You know anything about the survey maps for this section? She told him what she remembered. He listened without interrupting one of his consistent qualities, the patience of someone who understood that listening was a form of work. When she finished, he was quiet again for a moment, then said, the creek bed is territorial water. Has been since the Land Act of '68. Brackett's deed covers the upland to the high water mark. Below that is a different question. He said this without inflection, presenting it as information rather than encouragement. Crane will know this if you ask him directly. The right question matters more than a long argument. She looked at him. You know this land? I've known this land a long time. Something moved across his face, brief and controlled. I knew it before Brackett had his name on any of it. He didn't elaborate and she didn't press him because the fire was warm and the information he had given her was sufficient for what she needed. Some things were offered on their own schedule. The sheriff arrived not on Friday but on Thursday afternoon, which told her Brackett had some influence over the timing, even if he didn't have Crane in his pocket. The sheriff was a compact man in his 50s with a gray mustache and the careful movement of someone who had learned to read situations before committing to them. He came alone, a professional statement. He was here to execute a legal function, not to intimidate. He picked his way down the ravine wall with more agility than his age suggested and stood on the bank and looked at the camp with the systematic gaze of a man making notes. His eyes moved over the weir, the repaired smoking rack, the clay-patched overhang entrance, the stack of cordwood Eli had built against the eastern wall. He looked at May, who stood in the entrance, watching him with her dark, cataloging eyes. He looked at Eli, who stood beside Clara, with the stillness of a boy who had decided that stillness was his strongest position. Then he looked at Clara. He unfolded the document. He read it in a voice that was official without being theatrical, the voice of a man who respected the law enough not to perform it. The language was Brackett's language: trespass, unlawful occupation, private property removal. It named the parcel. It cited the deed. Clara waited until he finished and refolded the paper. Then she asked her question, the one Silas had pointed her toward, slowly and clearly. Sheriff Crane, does Colonel Brackett's deed specify the creek bed itself, or only the upland to the high water mark, I ask? Because the county survey distinguishes between the two, and I'd like to understand what we're actually being asked to vacate. Crane's refolding stopped halfway. He looked at her with an expression that recalibrated something in his initial assessment. He finished folding the document and put it in his coat pocket. That's a question that requires me to look at the survey maps. He said, his voice shifting slightly, still official, but now the official of a man who has encountered a complication he intends to resolve properly. I'll need to verify before I can enforce. He looked around the camp again. In the meantime, I'll ask you to stay on the creek side of the high water mark." He paused, the high water mark being the line of debris on the bank there. He indicated a line that was, she noted, well upland of their current position. He climbed back out of the ravine without further ceremony. She stood on the bank and watched him go, and did not allow herself to feel the relief too fully, because relief had a way of relaxing vigilance, and she could not afford that yet. Eli was looking at her. "What does that mean?" "It means we have more time than we had this morning." She turned back toward the overhang. "It means we use it." They used it. December arrived, and the temperature stopped negotiating. The creek iced at the edges, thin at first, then thickening inward by inches over the course of a week, until only a central channel remained open, fast and dark between white margins. The weir was in that central channel by design. She had positioned it there deliberately during construction, understanding that the location of permanent flow was the location of winter access. The fish moved more slowly in the cold, their metabolisms reduced to something close to waiting, but they still moved. The trap still caught them. The catches came out smaller and less frequent, but they came. Silas brought hides in the second week of December, a bundle of them, deer and rabbit, some already tanned to softness and some still stiff and needing work. He left them at the top of the ravine trail in the early morning before any of them were awake. And when Clara found them, she sat with them for a moment in the cold and understood what they represented in terms of warmth across the months ahead, and felt the specific gratitude that lives too deep for words. She and May worked the skins together in the afternoon, scraping and stretching, labor requiring 2 sets of hands, producing over the course of a week a rabbit fur lining for May's coat and a deer hide outer layer for Eli that transformed his silhouette from thin to adequate. Clara kept the scraps and pieced them together for her own hands, wrapping them with strips of the softest hide to create something that was not gloves, but functioned similarly when she was not in the water. May had become, over these weeks, a different kind of quiet. The silence of the first days had been the silence of someone who has gone somewhere internal because the external world had become too much. This new quiet was the silence of someone fully present and choosing specifically not to speak, because looking and making were sufficient forms of communication for what she needed to say. She drew constantly now on whatever surface was available: bark, flat stones, the compact dirt of the overhang floor. The drawings were precise and observational, the shape of a fish through the weave of the trap, the pattern of ice crystals on the rock face, Eli's profile when he didn't know he was being recorded. She gave some of the drawings to Clara without explanation. Just a flat piece of bark set quietly beside her while she worked, and Clara kept them in the flour sack with the letter and the riverstone. Eli grew in the first 2 months the daily work of hauling wood and maintaining the section of bank where they drew water, broadening his shoulders in a way that made his movement different, more grounded. He spoke more, not extensively, not with the volume of a child who has been encouraged to fill silence, but with a considered economy of someone choosing when speech added something that silence did not. He asked questions that were specific and practical. How to read the water for where fish held in winter. Which wood burned longest versus hottest. Why the clay from the North Bank section worked better for patching than the clay from the south. Clara answered each one as precisely as she could, and he filed the answers and used them. He had called her Clara for the first time during the storm. He continued to do so, and she noticed without comment that the way he said it had changed across the weeks. Less careful, less deliberate, more simply the name of someone in his orbit. The way you say the name of a person who has become structural. The letter waited in the flour sack. She knew this the way you know a fact that is not yet time for. She had learned enough in recent weeks to understand something of its probable contents. Silas had spoken carefully and in pieces about the history of the land and the people who had worked it, and what he had given her was a partial portrait of her aunt as a woman who had tried consistently across years to do right by a niece she had never been permitted to reach. The letter, she suspected, would give her the specifics. She was not yet ready for the specifics. She was still in the process of building the floor she would need to stand on while she read them. Reverend Holt arrived on a Wednesday in late January, which she knew because Eli's chalk marks said so. She saw him from the weir where she was clearing ice from the trap entrance, a task that required daily attention now. He stood at the top of the ravine and she knew him by the coat first, the good black coat out of place in this landscape, the way formal clothing is always out of place outdoors. He looked thinner. She would not have said it was possible for a man already as spare as Holt to look thinner, but he had managed it and his face had the particular drawn quality of someone who has not been sleeping well. He made his way down the ravine wall with less grace than Crane had managed, catching himself twice on exposed roots. She did not go to assist him. She finished clearing the trap entrance, waded back to the bank, and met him there. He looked at the camp for a long time, taking in specific things. She watched him register the solid overhang entrance with its clay and bark weatherproofing, the organized wood stack, the smoking rack rebuilt higher, and reinforced the weir standing in the dark water of the central channel. He looked at May standing in the entrance, watching him with the same quiet inventory she applied to everything. He looked at Eli, who had come to stand 2 feet to Clara's left with his arms folded. "They said you were living like savages," Holt said finally, and something in his voice had changed from the last time she had heard it, the clerical authority still there. But underneath it, something else, something that had been there all along and never surfaced. They were wrong. She waited. She had learned that Holt's silences often contained more than his words, and that the words, when they came, were worth understanding fully before responding to. He explained about Breckett, the hard winter, the cattle losses, the financial pressure that had made the northern parcels available. The church had discretionary funds. The parcel that included this section of creek could be purchased, entitled in her name, a legitimate homestead, a legal claim, a real foundation, instead of an occupation that depended on a sheriff's willingness to read survey language carefully. She looked at him and thought about what it had cost him to come here. Not the ride, which was difficult enough in January. The other cost, the one that showed in the thinness of his face and the quality of his sleeplessness, the cost of knowing what you have done and standing in front of the person you did it to and asking for something that looks like forgiveness but is actually something else. She reached into the flour sack. She took out the letter. She held it in front of her, the envelope soft from weeks of proximity to her body, her name in her aunt's careful hand still visible on the front. She looked at Holt's face when he saw it, and what she saw there confirmed everything Silas had given her in pieces. "She wrote this 3 years ago." Clara kept her voice even and factual. Not accusatory. Accusation was a performance, and she was not performing. She was making a record. She was trying to find me. You kept it. Holt looked at the letter. The silence that followed was the kind that contains an answer too heavy to lift. Then very quietly, barely carrying the distance between them, yes. The word cost him something real. She saw it cost him. She was not interested in his suffering, but she was interested in the truth, and the truth had just been confirmed in a single syllable, the most economical form of confession available. She looked at him for a long moment, long enough to let the confirmation settle into her body and become the new shape of what she knew. Then she said, "Is this charity or is this a debt?" The question landed in the air between them and stayed there. He seemed to be working through it, finding the answer in real time rather than retrieving one he had prepared. The quality of honesty in this, she noted, was worth something, even from him. "A debt," he said finally so quietly that if the creek had been running louder, she might have missed it. "Then we will accept." She folded the letter and put it back in the sack. "Have the deed drawn in my name. All 3 names, Clara Voss, Eli Thatcher, May Thatcher." She watched his face as she said this and saw him understand that she was not accepting a gift. She was executing a transfer of what was owed. "When it's done, send it with Crane. I don't require another visit." Holt stood for a moment in the cold with the particular stillness of a man who has discharged an obligation and is not certain whether he feels lighter or heavier for it. Then he turned and began the climb back out of the ravine, and she watched him go, and when he disappeared over the rim, She stood for a moment with her hands at her sides and felt the weight of the last 3 months settle into something she didn't have a precise name for. Not triumph, not relief, not peace exactly. The feeling of a structure that has been tested and found to be what it was built to be. Eli was behind her. She knew he had heard everything. She didn't turn around immediately, giving him the same privacy she had given herself the seconds needed to process something that changes the shape of what you know about your own history. When she turned, he was looking at the ravine wall where Holt had disappeared, his jaw set in the way it had been set on the wagon from Coldwater, the protective hardness that was also a form of grief wearing its working clothes. That letter, he said carefully. Mama was trying to find you. For at least 3 years, probably longer. He was quiet working through it. Then in a voice trying to stay in its practical register and not quite managing, she never stopped looking. It wasn't said to Clara exactly. It was said to the heir to the particular category of facts that hurt, because they are true rather than because they are false. She didn't fill the silence. Some things you stand next to rather than speaking around. May appeared at her elbow, moving from the entrance without sound, the way she moved through most spaces and slipped her hand into Clara's without announcement or ceremony. Her fingers were warm. She looked at the ravine rim, then at her brother, then at the weir in the water, and something in her expression was making a calculation too complex and too private to read fully. And Clara respected that and held her hand and waited for whatever came next. What came next was February, then March, then the things she had been calculating towards since the day she sighted the weir. The spring melt came earlier than the oldest records suggested it should. The snowpack on the upland to the north was substantial, 6 weeks of accumulation, and when the temperature broke in the first week of March, it broke quickly, the kind of fast thaw that sends water downhill faster than the ground can absorb it. She had been watching the upstream indicators for 2 weeks, noting the snow line's recession, calculating the approximate volume of meltwater moving toward them. The night the flood came, she was already awake. She had moved the smoked fish stores and the hide materials to the high rear shelf of the overhang 3 days earlier, had reinforced the base stakes of the weir with additional stone and rope in the preceding week. She had also, in the quiet of 2 consecutive evenings, while the children slept, deepened the channel on the western bank side of the weir by removing a series of large stones that had been deflecting flow in a way that would become problematic at high water, redistributing the current so that when the volume increased, it would move through the structure rather than around it at the bank join. This was the part of the preparation she had not told Eli about, because she had not been certain it was correct, and she was not willing to give him false confidence in an uncertain modification. Now standing at the creek edge at 2 in the morning, listening to the sound of the water, doing what she had anticipated, she felt the particular loneliness of a decision made in private whose consequences were arriving in public. Silas appeared out of the upstream darkness. He had come across earlier that evening before the main rise and had said simply, "I'll stay nearby." And she had understood this to mean precisely what it said. Not that he would take charge, not that he would intervene, but that he would be available, which was the form of help she most trusted, because it left the structure of her authority intact. He was beside her now at the creek edge, and they both looked at the water. The creek had risen 18 inches in the past 4 hours, and was still rising, the central channel dark and fast and purposeful. The ice that had persisted at the margins in thin shelves, now gone, carried downstream in chunks that caught the faint skylight and disappeared around the bend. The weir was audible, not the ordinary low frequency of normal current through the structure, but a higher, more urgent vibration, the sound of construction at the limit of its design. She waded in without discussion. The water was at her thighs, immediately colder than anything she had experienced since the storm in November, but carrying a different quality of cold moving cold, with the energy of melted snow, the cold of things that have been waiting in solid form and are now unleashed. She moved to the upstream face of the weir and put her hands on the frame. The frame was holding. She felt this as a physical fact transmitted through her palms. The vibration was significant, but the movement beneath it was zero. The stakes were in the bed. The rope lashings were taking the load and distributing it across the whole structure the way she had intended when she tied them. The willow weave was compressed by the current pressure, but not failing. If anything, the pressure was pushing the material tighter into the frame, making the walls denser rather than breaking them apart. She worked the frame section by section, moving laterally against the current, checking each joint, loading additional stones at the base where the water was finding gaps. Silas moved parallel to her on the eastern side, doing the same without instruction, his larger hands and greater weight useful at the sections where the current was strongest. They worked for 2 hours in the rising water and did not speak. The creek continued to rise. The weir continued to hold. The water peaked before dawn. She felt the moment it stopped rising, the way you feel a change in a sound you've been listening to for a long time. The current remained fierce for another hour, then began the slow recession that would take 3 days to complete. By morning, the sun was on the ravine rim, the water was 6 inches lower than its peak, and the weir stood in the receding current in the early light moss-patched rough completely intact. She stood on the bank and looked at it. Everything she knew about structures and load and distribution and the specific stubbornness required to build something that lasts, it was all in that collection of stone and willow and rope standing in a Dakota creek in the March light. It was not beautiful. It was better than beautiful. It was real, it was hers, and it had held. Silas came to stand beside her. He looked at the weir for a long time with his particular quality of attention. Then he said something she would keep for the rest of her life. Your father would have built it the same way. He said it quietly, looking at the water rather than at her, which was the courtesy of a man who understood the weight of what he was delivering. She turned to look at him. He had mentioned her father once briefly, in a way she had not pressed a name a year, a connection to this land that she had felt but not pursued because the timing had never been right. The timing was right now. She could feel it the same way she had felt the flood peak, a shift in pressure, a change in what the moment could hold. Tell me, she said. He did. He told her in the way he did everything in pieces in order without ornamentation. Her father, Thomas Voss, had worked this section of creek 30 years earlier, before Beckett had consolidated the northern parcels, when the land was still in smaller hands, and a man with skill could make something real in it. He had been a builder, not a carpenter, exactly more of a structural thinker, someone who looked at ground and water and understood the relationship between them. He had worked for Beckett briefly when Beckett was still a man of moderate ambition rather than large ones, and he had left when the ambition expanded into territory that required different ethics than Thomas Voss possessed. He had gone to Granger. He had built something there with a woman. He had been gone before the child was born. Silas did not know the specifics of why. He knew only that Ruth, the woman's sister, had spent years afterward trying to assemble the pieces, trying to locate the child, trying to do for the niece what the parents, for whatever reasons, had not managed to do for themselves. Clara listened to all of it without interrupting. She held the river stone in her fist inside her coat pocket and felt its smoothness. Long work of water on a hard surface, the patience required to make something smooth from something rough. And she thought about the woman who had carried this stone long enough that her warmth was in it, and about the man who had stood on this creek bank and understood it the way she did, the same instinct transmitted across a gap of years and absence, in the particular silence of things that are never explained. She did not cry. She had not cried since Coldwater, and she did not cry now. But something in her chest unlocked quietly the way ice unlocks in a slow thaw, not all at once, not dramatically, just a gradual yielding of pressure that had been held so long it had become indistinguishable from structure. He never knew about me, she said. It was not a question. I don't believe so. Silas looked at the water. But he built things that lasted, that's something. She thought about what it was worth, a man she would never meet, whose absence had been the defining fact of her life, who had built things that lasted on the same creek where she had built something that had just held a flood. She thought about what it meant that she had come here by what felt like accident, And it had not been an accident at all in the way that some destinations are chosen by something in the body that recognizes a place before the mind has the language for it. She was still thinking about this when she went back to the overhang and found Eli awake sitting in the entrance with his arms around his knees watching the ravine brighten with the morning sun. He looked at her wet clothes, at whatever was in her face, and she saw him measure the situation and arrive at a question he held back, which was his characteristic generosity to hold back until she was ready. She sat down beside him. May was still asleep in the back, one hand curled near her face, the other resting on a piece of bark that had a drawing on it, the weir rendered in charcoal lines so precise they could have served as an engineering document. Silas knew my father, Clara said. He worked this creek. Eli absorbed this. She watched him think about what it meant for her, then more slowly what it meant for all of them, the three of them, and the land under their feet, and the legal paper that was coming from Coldwater with their names on it. So this was already yours, he said finally, before any of it. In some way, she looked at the creek, the receding water, the weir standing in the morning light. Or I was already its. I'm not certain which direction it runs. He was quiet for a while. Then Dad used to say a man's worth is what he builds. He said it looking at his hands, the hands that had hauled branches and driven stakes and wrapped a bandage in the dark. Reckon that goes for anyone. She did not answer immediately. She let the words be what they were, a boy's inheritance from his father offered in the direction of the woman who had built something in front of him that the creek had tried to take and failed. It was more than she could respond to with language, so she did not try, and after a moment she set her hand briefly on his shoulder, one gesture that contained what words would have reduced, then stood up and went to the creek to begin the work of the day. The deed came 3 weeks later, delivered by Crane himself, who climbed down into the ravine with it in a leather case and stood on the bank with slightly more ceremony than his first visit, and slightly less than the situation probably warranted by formal standards. The document had 3 names on it. He handed it to Clara, and she read it, all of it, every line, the language of legal transfer that converted occupation into ownership and labor into title. She signed where indicated. She passed the document to Eli, who read it with the same thoroughness and signed in a hand that was still developing but was already precise. May signed last, her name small and careful and exact. Crane put the document back in its case, handed it to Clara, and said without inflection, "The parcel is yours." He looked at the weir once more before he climbed back out, and she had the impression he was looking at it the way Silas had looked at it, as a structural argument, self-evident, not requiring commentary. Silas helped them build the foundation for the house that summer. It was a modest foundation stone and mortar set back from the floodline, with a precision that came from his understanding of what the creek did in its various moods. He did not stay to see the walls go up. That work took 2 summers and involved a neighbor from 6 miles south who exchanged labor for a share of the fish harvest, which was the first of what became a series of arrangements Clara made with the people of that county. Over the years, barter systems built on what the creek reliably produced. Eli was 13 when the house was finished. He stood in the main room on the first evening they spent in it, looking at the walls and the window and the fireplace Silas had designed, and he said, "It's warm," which was true in every register. He meant it. May was 11 and already teaching herself to read from the 2 books Clara had acquired from a traveling merchant in exchange for smoked fish and a piece of bark on which she had drawn the merchant's portrait with such accuracy that he stood looking at it for 5 minutes before he remembered he was conducting a transaction. The books were a survey of North American flora and a history of territorial law, precisely the 2 subjects she would need most in the years that followed, which seemed like coincidence and was not. The weir lasted. That was the fact she had not fully allowed herself to believe during its construction, that a thing built by inexperienced hands from available materials in a desperate season could become something permanent. But each spring she walked down to check it, and each spring it was there, altered by floods added to, repaired in sections, the original willow replaced and replaced again as it deteriorated, the stone foundation unchanged beneath it, the stakes renewed by Eli when he was old enough to do the work the way it needed doing. By the time May's children were running the creek bank, it had the appearance of something geological, as if the creek itself had arranged the stones this way over centuries rather than a young woman of 18 having placed them by hand in weeks of cold and determination. Clara walked down one evening in the autumn of the year May's youngest was born. She went alone, which she preferred for this particular visit. Not really a visit, but a form of accounting. She performed each year a review of what it held and what required attention and what was new. The ravine was familiar in the specific way of a place that has been part of the body's daily reckoning for so long that the eyes no longer register it as scenery, but as context. The sound of the water was the sound her mind associated with thinking. She stood at the bank and looked at the weir. The stones were dark with moss and streaked with mineral deposits from decades of water moving over and through them. A heron stood at the downstream edge, patient and prehistoric, waiting for what the current would deliver. It regarded her and returned its attention to the water, which was the correct response to someone who was clearly not a threat. She put her hand in her coat pocket. The river stone was there where it had been every day of her adult life, smooth, cool, present. She took it out and held it in her palm and looked at it in the failing afternoon light. Just a stone, worn by a river that had been running longer than any of them, carried by a woman she had never known, given without words or explanation to a child who would spend decades making sense of the gift. The heron lifted off the downstream rocks and moved upstream past her, its wings making the sound of a slow and deliberate breath, and was gone around the bend. She closed her fingers around the stone. She thought about what it meant to build something in a place that was already yours before you knew it, to arrive by necessity at what was also in some structure below language, a form of return. She thought about a girl who had stood in a creek in October with cold water at her shins and a picture in her mind and no reason to believe it would work except the fact that not trying was not an option. That girl had been right, not because circumstances had been kind. They had not been kind. They had been brutal in the specific way of a world that does not notice when it discards people, but because the thing she had built was real, and real things do not disappear simply because they were difficult to make. She put the stone back in her pocket. The creek moved. The light on the water shifted with the clouds. She stood there a while longer, not because she needed to, but because she had earned the right to stand in a place she had built and belonged to it without apology, and she was not a person who wasted what she had earned. Then she turned and walked back up the bank toward the house where the lights were on, and the sound of her family moved behind the glass, and the foundation under it was stone.